For years, the war between Iran and Israel was something you had to infer. You saw it in explosions no one officially explained, in scientists who died under mysterious circumstances, in convoys hit on roads far from either capital, in militias, rockets, cyber attacks, sabotage, denials, warnings, funerals. It was real, but it lived in the half-light, in that gray zone where everyone knew and no one fully admitted. And then, one night, the sky gave the game away. In April 2024, Iran launched a direct barrage toward Israel. Drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. For the first time, the confrontation that had spent decades hiding behind proxies and plausible deniability stepped out into the open. Across the region, radars lit up, air defenses roared, governments panicked, and millions of people watched the oldest nightmare in the modern Middle East begin to take visible form. Not a crisis between strangers, a reckoning between enemies who had been building toward this moment for decades. That is what makes this story so dangerous and so misunderstood. Because most people hear Iran and Israel and assume this was inevitable. Ancient hatred, permanent hostility, two states born to collide. But that version is too simple. It misses the shock at the heart of the story. Iran and Israel were not always enemies. In fact, that is where the real story begins. Not with missiles, not with chance, not with assassinations or nuclear facilities or secret wars in Syria. It begins with a relationship that, at one time, made strategic sense. A quiet partnership, an understanding, a shared logic. Which means the question is not just why they fight. The real question is how a relationship that once worked, however discreetly, transformed into one of the most volatile rivalries on Earth. Because this was never just a normal conflict. It did not unfold like a conventional war, with formal declarations and clear front lines. It evolved in layers. First, as a political rupture. Then as an ideological crusade. Then as a regional contest. Then as a covert war of sabotage, kidnappings, shadow fleets, targeted killings, intelligence games, and armed groups positioned just far enough away to give everyone room to pretend this was still containable. That pretense lasted a long time, long enough for an entire generation to grow up inside a conflict that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Long enough for Iran to build influence through networks and partners, rather than traditional armies alone. Long enough for Israel to respond with a doctrine shaped by secrecy, preemption, and the belief that waiting was often more dangerous than acting. Long enough for both sides to convince themselves that as long as the fight remained indirect, it remained manageable. But shadow wars have a dark logic. They reward patience. They reward deception. They reward retaliation just small enough to avoid total war, but painful enough to demand a response. And over time, that logic changes the people trapped inside it. It hardens assumptions. It narrows choices. It teaches each side that pressure works, that humiliation must be answered, that vulnerability invites more aggression. The methods that are supposed to prevent a larger war begin slowly, almost invisibly, to prepare one. That is why this story matters so much now. Because what happened between Iran and Israel was not simply a feud deepening over time. It was a machine assembling itself, piece by piece, crisis by crisis. In Lebanon, in Damascus, in secret laboratories, in command rooms, in bombed convoys and hacked systems and speeches that sounded theatrical until the weapons behind them became impossible to ignore. And here is the most unsettling part. The shadow war did not fail because it was weak. It failed because, for a very long time, it worked. It gave both sides a way to hurt each other without crossing the line. It gave them room to calibrate, to signal, to retaliate, to keep climbing without admitting they were climbing. Until one day the distance between indirect conflict and direct confrontation was no longer wide enough to hold them apart. By then, the shadows were not hiding the war, they were feeding it. So when the missiles finally crossed openly, it was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story became impossible to ignore. The visible eruption of something that had been forming for decades beneath the surface, gathering force in silence, waiting for the right shock to reveal what it had become. To understand why the sky eventually lit up, you have to go back to the years when Iran and Israel were never supposed to be enemies at all. Long before the missiles, before the slogans, before the shadow war acquired its own mythology, Iran and Israel had something far more unsettling in common. They needed each other. Not openly, not romantically, not in the language nations like to use when they want history to sound noble. This was a colder relationship than that, more discreet, more useful, built not on trust, but on logic. In a Middle East dominated by Arab nationalism, coups, rival blocs, and the pressure of the Cold War, Israel and the Shah's Iran looked at the same map and saw the same problem. They were both non-Arab states trying to survive in a region that could easily isolate them. And so, quietly, they moved toward one another. Israel, young and regionally isolated, had what Iran could use: expertise, weapons, intelligence links. Iran, wealthy and strategically vital, had what Israel desperately needed: oil, access, depth. Over time, the relationship thickened into something like a de facto alliance, even if both sides preferred not to advertise it too loudly. Iran informally recognized Israel in 1950. Israeli officials operated in Tehran. Iranian channels stayed open to Tel Aviv. Businessmen, technicians, security figures, and intermediaries built a web of cooperation that was real precisely because it remained so carefully unofficial. And that discretion mattered. Because even at its height, this relationship was never rooted in public affection. It did not rest on shared culture or moral kinship. It rested on the Shah's vision of Iran: modern, secularizing, strategically aligned with the West, suspicious of Arab radicalism, and convinced that power came from elite statecraft, not public sentiment. Israel fit into that world. It was part of a wider regional logic in which Tehran wanted strength, order, and leverage. But that also meant the relationship was balanced on one man's system, one monarchy's confidence, one political order that looked solid from the outside and far less secure from within. That is the first great irony of this story. The future enemies of Israel were not yet in power, but some of the forces that would one day define them were already gathering under the surface of the Shah's Iran. After the 1953 coup that restored Mohammad Reza Shah with US and British backing, his rule grew more centralized, more autocratic, and more dependent on coercion. Then came the White Revolution, the Shah's ambitious modernization drive. On paper, it promised reform, development, and a leap into the future. In practice, it also disrupted old social structures, accelerated urbanization, marginalized rivals, and deepened the sense among many Iranians that the regime was racing ahead of its own society while silencing anyone who questioned the price. So while Iran and Israel were cooperating above the level of strategy, something more dangerous was happening below it. The Shah was building a state that looked stronger and more modern, but also more brittle. To his admirers, he was turning Iran into a major power. To his critics, he was hollowing it out. Westernized, militarized, increasingly repressive, and ever more detached from the religious and social currents that still shaped much of Iranian life. The alliance with Israel did not cause that rupture by itself, but inside a country already straining under inequality, repression, foreign resentment, and cultural dislocation, it became one more symbol of a monarchy that many people felt no longer spoke their language. And yet, from the perspective of statecraft, the arrangement worked. That is what makes it so important. This was not an accidental flirtation. It endured for decades because it served both regimes. Iran gained weapons, technical assistance, and intelligence cooperation. Israel gained energy, regional connection, and a rare relationship with a major Muslim country that did not begin and end with public hostility. In a region built on visible antagonism, theirs was a partnership of whispers. Useful whispers, profitable whispers, strategic whispers. But whispers have a weakness. They are easy to deny and easy to reverse. Because the deeper truth was that this relationship never solved the question that mattered most. What kind of country Iran was becoming underneath the Shah's polished exterior? The alliance with Israel belonged to the monarchy's Iran, the court's Iran, the security state's Iran, the Iran that imagined itself as modern because it could command, buy, suppress, and align. But beneath that surface, another Iran was gathering force, angrier, more religiously charged, more anti-imperial, more willing to interpret the Shah's foreign ties not as strategy, but as surrender. And when that buried Iran finally rose, Israel would not just lose a partner, it would become part of the indictment. When the Shah fell in 1979, Iran did not simply change governments, it changed meaning. That is the mistake people make when they tell this story too quickly. They imagine the Islamic Revolution as a transfer of power, one ruling elite replaced by another. But what happened in Iran was more radical than that. The revolution was not just trying to seize the state. It was trying to redefine what the state was for, what it represented, who it served, and what kind of world it belonged to. And in that new world, Israel could no longer remain what it had been under the Shah, a useful, quiet partner in a difficult region. It had to become something else, a symbol. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini did not build the Islamic Republic around narrow diplomacy. He built it around a moral and civilizational revolt against humiliation, monarchy, dependency, Western domination, and the political order that had kept figures like the Shah in power. That gave the revolution enormous force. It was not only political, it was emotional, spiritual, social. It told millions of Iranians that they were not merely witnessing the collapse of a regime. They were taking part in the purification of a nation. And revolutions need enemies almost as much as they need ideals. For the new regime, the United States became the Great Satan, the ultimate external sponsor of the old order. Israel became something different, but no less important. It became the visible regional extension of everything the revolution claimed to reject: Western power, strategic subordination, secular statecraft, and the humiliation of Muslims through force and occupation. Under the Shah, ties with Israel had been justified as realism. Under the Islamic Republic, those same ties became evidence of corruption. The partnership was not merely canceled, it was morally inverted. That inversion mattered because it transformed hostility toward Israel from a policy choice into part of the Islamic Republic's self-image. This was no longer just about embassies, trade links, or diplomatic recognition. The new regime needed to prove that it was not the Shah's Iran, in religious language, in revolutionary language, and in geopolitical language. Breaking with Israel did all three at once. The Israeli mission in Tehran was handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization. Support for the Palestinian cause was elevated from solidarity to doctrine. Anti-Israel rhetoric moved from the margins to the center of state identity. But rhetoric alone does not explain what made this so powerful. The deeper change was that Israel now served two functions for revolutionary Iran at the same time. It was an external enemy, yes, but it was also an internal organizing tool. Opposition to Israel helped bind together religion, revolution, anti-imperialism, and regional ambition into a single narrative. It allowed the regime to present itself not merely as the ruler of Iran, but as the defender of a wider moral struggle that reached far beyond Iran's borders. That made the conflict larger than either country, and more dangerous. Because Israel was no longer dealing with a state that simply disliked it or competed with it, it was dealing with a regime that had woven resistance into its legitimacy. A regime that could treat confrontation not as an unfortunate cost, but as proof of authenticity. In that kind of system, moderation can look like betrayal. Distance can look like weakness. Compromise can begin to feel like ideological decay. Still, in the first years after the revolution, the picture was not yet as straightforward as it would later appear. The new Islamic Republic was unstable, divided, still consolidating power, and then suddenly consumed by the Iran-Iraq War. Survival came first. The regime had to purge opponents, build institutions, suppress rivals, and defend the country from invasion. In those years, the revolutionary worldview was already there, but its regional machinery was not yet fully built. That would come later. And that delay matters because it reveals something essential about how this rivalry developed. The hatred was immediate. The structure was not. Revolutionary Iran declared Israel illegitimate very early. But declarations are not the same as capability. Turning ideology into pressure required institutions, networks, doctrine, and a battlefield on which this new vision of power could be tested. That battlefield arrived in Lebanon. And when it did, the conflict changed shape again. Because this is where the story becomes more than slogans, more than chants, more than diplomatic rupture. This is where revolutionary identity begins to harden into strategy. Where opposition to Israel stops being symbolic and starts becoming operational. Where Iran discovers that it may not need to fight Israel directly to wound it, contain it, and keep it under permanent pressure. That discovery would echo for decades. Because once the revolution found a way to export itself through armed networks instead of speeches alone, the confrontation with Israel stopped being a posture. It became a system. Revolutions always face the same test. Can they survive the moment after the slogans? Can they turn moral energy into actual power? For Iran's new rulers, that test arrived not first in Tehran, but in Lebanon. a fractured country, a battlefield layered with militias, invasions, sectarian fear, Palestinian armed groups, foreign armies, and a state too weak to control its own territory. In the early 1980s, Lebanon was not just another arena of Middle Eastern chaos. It was the place where revolutionary Iran found the perfect laboratory for a new kind of war. And Israel helped create the conditions for it. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, its immediate goals were tied to the Palestine Liberation Organization and the violence spilling across its northern border. But wars do not stay inside the intentions that start them. The invasion shattered what remained of Lebanon's fragile balance and opened a new strategic space in the country's Shiite areas, especially in the Bekaa Valley and the south. Into that space stepped Iran, not with divisions and Air Force squadrons, with something more adaptable. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sent personnel into Lebanon, working through Syria's permission and Lebanon's disorder, to cultivate, train, arm, and ideologically shape a new force. Not merely a militia, not just another armed faction in an overcrowded civil war. This was something far more consequential: Hezbollah. At first glance, it might have looked like one more militant group born from the wreckage of Lebanon. But that reading misses the scale of what Iran had discovered. Hezbollah was not important simply because it could fire rockets or carry out attacks. It mattered because it fused three things at once: religious legitimacy, local roots, strategic utility. That combination changed the game. Hezbollah spoke the language of resistance, martyrdom, and Shiite empowerment in a country where many Shiites had long felt neglected, exposed, and politically secondary. But it also became something else: a disciplined, armed partner that could pressure Israel without requiring Iran to fight a conventional war. Distance became an advantage. Deniability became an asset. Influence no longer depended on tanks crossing borders. It could move through training, money, doctrine, logistics, and belief. This was the real breakthrough. Iran had found a way to project power westward, toward Israel's front door, without needing to match Israel symmetrically. It did not need a modern air force that could dominate the skies over Tel Aviv. It did not need to defeat Israel in open battle. It only needed to create a durable pressure point, a force embedded in local terrain, hardened by ideology, and able to make Israel pay again and again, even when Tehran itself remained physically distant. That was a revelation. Because before Lebanon, revolutionary hostility toward Israel had been loud, but structurally limited. Iran could denounce. It could posture. It could claim moral leadership. But in Lebanon, it gained something far more dangerous than rhetoric. It gained leverage. And Hezbollah became the prototype for a whole strategic worldview, one in which the most effective way to fight a stronger enemy was not head-on, but through networks, through patience, through layered deterrence, through a partner that was local enough to be credible, armed enough to be feared, and aligned enough to serve a larger regional design. From Israel's perspective, this was not just another border problem. It was the emergence of a new kind of threat. The old model of conflict was at least legible. States mobilized, armies crossed, ceasefires followed. But this was murkier, harder to contain, harder to deter cleanly. Israel was no longer just confronting neighboring hostility. It was confronting a strategy designed to keep hostility alive indefinitely. and Lebanon taught both sides lessons they would never forget. Iran learned that proxy warfare could do more than compensate for weakness. It could produce strategic depth. It could bleed an adversary, stretch its attention, and create a permanent front without requiring formal war. Israel learned that even overwhelming military superiority could struggle against an enemy rooted in ideology, embedded in local society, and backed by a state operating from the shadows. The war was no longer just political. It was becoming architectural. Iran was not simply opposing Israel now. It was building a method for opposing Israel. A method that could survive setbacks, absorb punishment, and spread. What started in Lebanon would not stay in Lebanon. It would become doctrine, a blueprint, a system of pressure that could be adapted, expanded, and repeated across the region. And once that system began to grow, Israel was no longer facing a single enemy across a single border. It was facing the possibility of encirclement. What Iran built in Lebanon did not stay there. That is the moment the story gets bigger. Hezbollah was not the end point. It was the proof of concept, a demonstration that Iran did not need to defeat Israel in a single decisive war to change the balance of power. It could do something more sustainable, and in some ways, more dangerous. It could build a regional ecosystem of pressure, a network of armed movements, political partners, supply routes, training pipelines, and ideological alliances that made Israel feel less like it was facing one enemy and more like it was living inside a widening ring of them. This is where the phrase axis of resistance starts to matter. Not because it was ever one perfectly obedient block directed from Tehran like pieces on a board. It was looser than that, more uneven, more improvised, shaped by local agendas and different histories. But that is exactly what made it powerful. Iran was not creating clones. It was cultivating partners. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, ties to Hamas despite the sectarian and ideological differences, militias in Iraq, later armed influence reaching through Syria and into Yemen through the Houthis. Different actors, different motives, different levels of dependence on Tehran. Yet together, they created something larger than a list of groups. They created strategic depth. For Iran, this solved several problems at once. It helped compensate for conventional military weaknesses. It allowed Tehran to project power far beyond its own borders without always exposing itself to direct retaliation. It extended deterrence outward so that pressure on Iran could trigger costs elsewhere. And it wrapped all of that in a language that made it sound like principle rather than merely strategy. Resistance, liberation, defense of Palestine, defense of holy sites, anti-imperial struggle. These ideas were not just decoration. They helped Iran bind together partners that did not all share the same ethnicity, sect, or national agenda, but could still be joined by a common enemy and a common narrative. That was the second great breakthrough after Lebanon. Iran had discovered that influence did not have to move in straight lines. It could move through chaos, through failed states, civil wars, occupations, sectarian fractures, and collapsing borders. Every regional crisis became a possible opening. Every weak government created space for armed actors. Every conflict offered Tehran a chance to deepen relationships, move weapons, gain leverage, and position itself as the patron of forces willing to fight where the Iranian state preferred not to appear directly. And from Israel's perspective, this looked less like ideology than encirclement. That is a crucial shift in how the rivalry evolved. Early on, the conflict could still be read as revolutionary theater mixed with proxy pressure. But as the network widened, Israel increasingly saw something more systematic. Iran was building a map. A military and political geography designed to hem Israel in from multiple directions, surrounded with rocket arsenals and militant infrastructures, and make any future confrontation broader, messier, and more expensive. The threat was no longer just what Iran said. It was what Iran was assembling. And this changed Israeli thinking in a fundamental way. Because a single enemy can be deterred in familiar ways. A network is different. A network can absorb losses and reroute pressure. If one arm weakens, another can fire. If one front cools, another can flare. If Tehran remains untouched, its partners can still generate crisis. That meant Israel was not simply dealing with separate security problems in Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, Iraq, or beyond. It was beginning to interpret them as connected parts of one larger strategic design, even when the connections were imperfect and the coordination was not absolute. That interpretation produced its own dark consequences. The more Israel saw a unified architecture, the more it responded not only to immediate attacks, but to the possibility of future ones. This is how shadow conflicts deepen. Each side stops reacting only to what is visible and starts reacting to what it believes is being built behind the curtain. Intentions become weapons. Infrastructure becomes a warning. Potential becomes provocation. And slowly, another fear began to rise above all the others. Because if Iran could build this much influence without possessing the ultimate deterrent, what would happen if one day it did? That question changed everything. It turned a regional rivalry into an existential calculation. It made every militia, every missile shipment, every covert operation feel connected to a more terrifying horizon. For Israel, the problem was no longer just the ring of fire forming around its borders. It was the possibility that, behind that ring, a nuclear clock was ticking. There are rivalries that can be managed. And then there are rivalries that begin to feel irreversible. For Israel, the moment Iran's regional strategy fused with its nuclear ambitions, the entire conflict changed weight. Hezbollah was dangerous. Militias across the region were dangerous. Missiles, proxies, and the expanding architecture of pressure were dangerous. But all of those threats still belonged to a familiar category. They were frightening, but they were still part of a conventional logic of deterrence, attrition, retaliation, and survival. A nuclear-capable Iran was something else. It was not just another threat. It was the threat that could transform every other threat. That is why the nuclear issue became the most existential layer of the rivalry. Not because Iran had already crossed the line to a bomb, but because Israel increasingly feared what would happen if the line ever disappeared. If Iran could enrich further, shorten its breakout time, harden its facilities, deepen its technical expertise, and move ever closer to a threshold position, then the entire strategic map would change. Every militia under Iran's umbrella would look more dangerous. Every Israeli strike would feel riskier. Every regional crisis would unfold under a darker horizon. This was not simply about one weapon. It was about what one weapon would do to everything else. From Tehran's point of view, the nuclear program was always framed differently. Iranian officials insisted it was peaceful, sovereign, and lawful. They spoke the language of science, national pride, deterrence against outside pressure, and technological self-respect. That language mattered because it allowed Iran to present the program not as aggression, but as independence. In a country shaped by memories of foreign interference, sanctions, war, and isolation, the nuclear issue could be sold not only as strategy, but as dignity. And that made it harder to separate what Iran believed from what Israel feared. Because nuclear programs do not operate only in laboratories. They operate in imagination, in uncertainty, in worst-case thinking, in the gaps between declared intention and possible capability. Israel did not have to believe Iran was certain to build a bomb tomorrow to conclude that a threshold Iran would still be intolerable. The danger, from the Israeli perspective, was that once the technical knowledge, the enrichment capacity, and the protected infrastructure matured enough, stopping the program might become politically, militarily, and diplomatically far more difficult. That is when the rivalry stopped being only geographic. It became temporal. Time itself became part of the conflict. Every delay mattered. Every negotiation mattered. Every centrifuge mattered. Every inspection dispute, every stockpile increase, every fortified facility buried deeper underground carried strategic meaning far beyond the technical details. Israel began to think less like a country waiting to identify a single decisive moment, and more like a country trapped in a race against a clock it could hear, but not fully see. That sense of compression changed behavior. Because when states believe the future may lock in a permanent disadvantage, they become more willing to act early, covertly, and outside ordinary rules. Waiting starts to look irresponsible. Restraint starts to resemble surrender. A strike that once seemed escalatory begins to feel preventative. This is one of the darkest transformations in any rivalry. When fear of what may happen later justifies actions now that make the present more unstable. And there was another reason the nuclear issue felt so different. It touched the deepest psychological nerve in Israeli strategic culture. Israel is a state built not only around power, but around memory, around the conviction that existential danger must be recognized before it fully arrives, around the belief that depending on the promises of others can be fatal. In that mindset, Iran's nuclear advances were not processed as a routine diplomatic dispute. They were absorbed into a much older and more emotional framework, one in which delay could become disaster and ambiguity could become vulnerability. So by the time the nuclear file grew larger, the rivalry had already changed shape again. Iran no longer looked to Israel like merely a sponsor of armed pressure on the edges. It looked like a state trying to combine regional encirclement with the possibility of strategic immunity. A network of proxies outside, a missile arsenal in development, hardened facilities at home, and a leadership whose hostility was not tactical but ideological. That combination was intolerable. And once a threat begins to feel intolerable, the methods used to confront it begin to change. This is where the shadow war turns darker, more intimate, more deniable, less symbolic. Because when armies are too blunt, diplomacy feels too slow, and open war feels too risky. States reach for instruments that live in the seam between peace and catastrophe. Malware, sabotage, assassinations, mysterious explosions, silent penetrations of the enemy's most guarded spaces. The bomb had not gone off, but the fear of what it might one day make possible had already started a different kind of war. And that war would be fought not on front pages first, but in secrets, in whispers, and in blood. This is the phase of the story where the rivalry stops looking like a regional struggle and starts looking like a ghost story. Not because it becomes less real, because it becomes harder to see clearly. The front lines dissolve, the battlefield slips underground, into laboratories, server rooms, car windows, safe houses, convoys, warehouses, electrical systems, human routines. Men leave home and do not come back. Facilities explode without a declared war. Viruses cross borders no army can see. Leaders deny, hint, threaten, mourn, and move on. Everyone understands what is happening. Almost no one says it plainly. This was the covert phase of the Iran-Israel conflict, and it changed the psychology of the rivalry. Because once a war moves into secrecy, the goal is no longer only to destroy. It is to penetrate, to prove that distance is an illusion, that walls can be crossed, that the enemy's most guarded programs, most prized people, and most protected spaces are still vulnerable. And in that kind of war, humiliation matters almost as much as damage. One of the most famous moments came with Stuxnet, the malicious code that targeted centrifuges at Iran's Natanz enrichment facility. It did not announce itself with aircraft or missiles. It slipped into the machinery and turned the infrastructure against itself. Analysts later treated it as a landmark in cyber conflict because it showed that software could reach into the physical heart of a nuclear program and quietly sabotage it from within. For Israel, and for the wider anti-Iran effort it was often linked to, this was an extraordinary kind of pressure. Deniable, precise, and below the threshold of open war. For Iran, it was something more chilling. Proof that even its most fortified ambitions could be touched by invisible hands. Then came the killings. Beginning in the early 2000s, Iranian nuclear scientists were targeted in a string of assassinations that Tehran blamed on Israel. The details varied, but the message did not. This was not just about slowing a program. It was about making expertise itself feel hunted. Years later, the killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the scientist widely described as central to Iran's past weapons-related work, carried that logic to its most dramatic form. His death in November 2020 was not merely an attack on one man. It was a signal that the covert war had reached deep into the symbolic core of Iran's nuclear project. And the sabotage did not stop. Natanz was hit again and again by disruptions and suspicious incidents, including the 2021 blackout that Iran called an act of sabotage and blamed on Israel. The technical details mattered, but the emotional effect mattered more. Every strike said the same thing. Your program is not secure. Your timeline is not yours alone. And your enemies may know more about your vulnerabilities than you do. This is what covert war does at its most sophisticated. It does not merely inflict damage, it contaminates confidence. The war widened beyond destruction into exposure. In 2018, Benjamin Netanyahu publicly unveiled what Israel said was a huge cache of Iranian nuclear documents seized from a secret archive in Tehran. Whether one saw the operation as intelligence brilliance, political theater, or both, the effect was unmistakable. Israel was not only trying to disrupt Iran's capabilities, it was trying to dominate the narrative around them, to prove that Tehran's secrecy could be breached and that Iran's denials could be turned into evidence against it on the world stage. A covert operation had become a public performance of penetration. But here is the paradox at the center of all this. These methods were supposed to prevent a larger war. Instead, they trained both sides for one. For Israel, covert action offered a way to delay danger without paying the price of full military confrontation. For Iran, absorbing those blows while rebuilding, retaliating indirectly, and preserving strategic patience became part of its own doctrine. Each side believed it was acting below the threshold. Each side believed it was managing escalation. Yet every assassination, every sabotage, every humiliation, every whispered attribution hardened the same lesson. The enemy will keep coming, and restraint will not protect you. That is how the shadows became addictive. They gave leaders options. They gave intelligence services enormous influence. They gave both states the illusion that they could calibrate pain without losing control of the overall conflict. But covert war has a corrosive side effect. Because it is deniable, it becomes repeatable. Because it is repeatable, it becomes normal. And once it becomes normal, the threshold for what counts as extraordinary starts to disappear. The unclaimed war becomes the expected war. And then something even more dangerous happens. The battlefield expands again. Not just into code or laboratories, but into live regional terrain where supply lines, bases, militias, and airstrikes all begin to overlap. A place where Iran is no longer fighting Israel only through distant networks, but trying to build a military presence along a corridor running westward through war-torn land. That place was Syria. And in Syria, the shadow war moved closer to Israel than ever before. If Lebanon was where Iran learned how to pressure Israel through a partner, Syria was where that strategy became geographic. Before Syria, the shadow war was dangerous, but there was still distance in it. Tehran could fund, train, arm, and influence. Hezbollah could threaten Israel from Lebanon. Covert operations could reach across borders. But Syria changed something fundamental. It offered Iran not just another proxy arena, but a physical corridor. A live bridge of territory, logistics, bases, warehouses, commanders, and supply routes stretching westward through Iraq and Syria toward Lebanon and the Mediterranean. What had once been a network now had the potential to become a contiguous military ecosystem. That transformation did not happen in a vacuum. It grew out of the Syrian civil war. When Bashar al-Assad's regime began to crack after 2011, Iran moved aggressively to keep it alive. Not out of sentiment, but out of strategy. Syria was too important to lose. It linked Tehran to Hezbollah, anchored the wider axis of resistance, and gave Iran a forward position in the Levant that no speech or slogan could replace. Hezbollah joined the fight. Iranian advisors and Revolutionary Guard figures deepened their role. Militias flowed in. The war in Syria did not just reveal Iran's regional ambitions, it expanded them. And that is where Israel saw the next stage of the threat taking shape. Because from Jerusalem, this was no longer only about saving Assad. It looked like Iran was using the cover of Syria's collapse to build a more permanent military architecture near Israel's borders. Weapons transfers, precision-guided missile projects, command posts, storage facilities, air corridors, ground corridors. The old danger had been Hezbollah in Lebanon. The new danger was Hezbollah, plus a deepening Iranian footprint inside Syria itself. tied together by an emerging land bridge that could move men and materiel from Iran through Iraq, across Syrian territory, and on toward Lebanon. That is why Syria became the great laboratory of Israel's campaign between wars. The phrase sounds clinical, almost bureaucratic, but the idea behind it was brutally simple. If Iran was building the next front in the shadows, Israel would strike it before that front fully matured. Not with one dramatic war, but with repeated, calibrated action below the threshold of full-scale confrontation. Airstrikes on weapons depots, strikes on convoys, strikes on commanders, strikes on facilities tied to Iranian entrenchment and arms transfers. The goal was not to conquer Syria. It was to deny Iran the ability to transform Syria into a hardened platform for future war. This made the rivalry feel closer than ever before. Not emotionally closer, physically closer. The old model had Tehran at a distance, with pressure radiating outward through allies. Syria compressed that map. Iranian officers, Hezbollah operatives, Syrian territory, Israeli aircraft, Russian presence, collapsing state structures, and regional supply lines all began to overlap inside one of the most volatile spaces on Earth. The battlefield was no longer abstract. It was immediate, layered, and crowded with actors who did not all want the same thing, but could all be pulled into the same fire. And the more Israel struck, the clearer the pattern became. This was not merely retaliation for isolated incidents. It was a sustained effort to stop a strategic reality from solidifying. Israel was trying to interrupt a future before it arrived. Iran, meanwhile, kept probing, adapting, reconstituting, and testing how much infrastructure it could build, move, and protect under constant pressure. Syria became the place where both sides rehearsed a larger war, while insisting they were still avoiding one. That is the hidden logic that made Syria so dangerous. It shortened the fuse. In Lebanon, the threat was already serious, but at least it was familiar. In Syria, the threat was fluid, still forming, still mobile, still deniable. That made it harder to deter with traditional rules. Israel did not only fear what Iran was doing, it feared what Iran was about to finish. Iran did not only resent Israeli strikes, it learned that any pause could invite more strikes. So both sides became trapped in a cycle, driven not just by present attacks, but by anticipated futures. The war was no longer over events alone. It was over trajectories. And then came the final twist. For years, Syria had allowed the shadow war to intensify without fully breaking open. It was the place where escalation could still be explained away as containment, interdiction, signaling, or deterrence. But once the battlefield moved this close, once Iranian officers and Israeli aircraft were operating inside the same tightening arena, the margin for error began to collapse. The war was still mostly indirect, but one regional shock would soon tear away the last illusion that it could stay that way. For years, the shadow war had depended on one central illusion, that however violent it became, however many people died, however many missiles were stockpiled, however many scientists were killed, however many convoys burned on desert roads, the conflict could still be managed because the two states themselves were not fully colliding. There were buffers, proxies, distance, ambiguity. After October 7th, that illusion began to crack. Because the Gaza war did not stay in Gaza. Hezbollah opened fire from Lebanon. The Houthis began attacking shipping and launching toward Israel. Militias in Iraq and Syria moved under the banner of resistance. Israel was suddenly fighting on multiple fronts at once, and whether Tehran controlled every trigger or not, the war had activated the regional ecosystem Iran had spent decades helping build. What had once looked like separate theaters now started to vibrate like connected wires. That changed the emotional physics of the rivalry. Before, Israel could still tell itself that Iran was the distant architect, dangerous, but one step removed. Iran could still tell itself that armed pressure through partners created leverage without forcing a direct state-on-state reckoning. But after October 7th, the distance between sponsor and battlefield began to collapse. Every rocket from Lebanon, every strike in Syria, every escalation around Gaza pushed the same underlying question closer to the surface. How long could this war remain indirect when the network built for pressure was now under live, simultaneous strain? Then came April 1st, 2024. An Israeli strike in Damascus destroyed a building in Iran's diplomatic compound and killed senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers, including General Mohammad Reza Zahedi. This was not another murky convoy hit or anonymous sabotage deep in the shadows. It struck a site tied to diplomatic protections and killed men at the top of Iran's regional military architecture. Tehran understood the message instantly. Israel was no longer just degrading the machinery of Iranian power. It was hitting symbols of Iranian sovereignty itself. What happened next was historic. On April 13th and 14th, Iran launched more than 300 drones and missiles toward Israel in its first direct attack from Iranian territory. The old grammar of the conflict broke in plain view. This was no longer only Hezbollah firing from Lebanon, or covert teams operating in the dark, or deniable militias acting from somewhere in between. Iran itself had stepped onto the battlefield. The attack was heavily intercepted by Israel and its partners, but that almost misses the point. The military effect was limited. The political threshold it crossed was not. And yet, even then, both sides still tried to preserve a fragment of the old logic. Iran telegraphed enough to signal controlled retaliation rather than unlimited war. Israel answered, but carefully. Both were still behaving like powers terrified of the abyss, even while taking turns walking closer to it. That is what made 2024 so unnerving. The confrontation was becoming direct, but not fully admitted as a new era. It was as if both sides could feel the threshold breaking and still hoped language, calibration, and deniability at the margins might somehow hold it together. But the pressure did not ease. By late 2024, Israel had dealt Hezbollah some of its heaviest blows in years, culminating in the killing of Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, alongside senior figures tied to Iran's regional apparatus. For Tehran, this was not just the loss of an ally. Hezbollah was the crown jewel of the entire proxy model, the most successful expression of Iran's long war against Israel. To see that structure battered so openly was to see the old architecture of deterrence under direct assault. Then the sky lit up again. On October 1st, 2024, Iran fired roughly 200 ballistic missiles at Israel in a second direct attack, saying it was acting in response to killings that included Nasrallah and others. This time, the exchange felt less like an exception and more like a pattern taking shape. A state strike, a response, then another. The shadow war had not disappeared, but it no longer contained the center of gravity. The center was moving out into the open. And that is the final twist in the entire story. The shadow war did not fail because it was too weak to matter. It failed because it had become too effective at building habits of escalation. For decades, both sides learned that pressure could be applied without crossing all the way into open war. Iran learned it could surround, arm, and threaten through layers. Israel learned it could disrupt, assassinate, and strike before threats fully matured. Each move made sense inside its own doctrine. Each move also trained the next one. Until eventually, the methods designed to avoid direct war made direct war easier to imagine. That is what 2024 exposed. Not a sudden rupture from nowhere, but the unveiling of a conflict that had been rehearsing itself for years. The proxies were still there. The covert operations were still there. The denials were still there. But the distance that had once made the whole system feel manageable was gone. And once that distance disappeared, the real horror of the rivalry came into view. The shadow war had not remained in the shadows. It had been building the road to open confrontation the entire time. And now, the final question is no longer how the rivalry escalated. It is what this long war, hidden for so long, has made both sides capable of becoming. So how did Iran and Israel become shadow war enemies? Not because they were destined to, not because ancient hatred made it unavoidable, and not because one single event suddenly turned partners into permanent adversaries. They became shadow war enemies because history gave them a rupture, ideology gave that rupture meaning, and strategy gave it a method. That is the deepest answer. Under the Shah, Iran and Israel could cooperate because both were operating inside the logic of states. Cold logic, strategic logic, useful logic. They did not need affection. They did not need public intimacy. They only needed aligned interests. But when the Islamic Revolution came, it did more than replace one government with another. It changed the story Iran told about itself. Israel was no longer just a country on the map. It became part of the new regime's moral universe, a symbol against which revolutionary Iran could define its purity, its defiance, and its claim to leadership. Then the rivalry evolved again. Because ideology alone does not sustain a conflict for decades. It needs infrastructure. It needs institutions. It needs a way to convert belief into pressure. That is what Lebanon gave Iran. That is what Hezbollah proved. And from there, the method spread outward. Networks instead of divisions. Proxies instead of direct state war. Influence built not only through borders, but through movements, militias, missiles, and corridors. The confrontation stopped being a matter of speeches and started becoming a regional architecture. For Israel, that architecture changed the meaning of the threat. Iran was no longer just hostile. It was patient, layered, adaptive. It was building pressure points around Israel's edges, while also moving closer to a nuclear threshold that could transform every other front. So Israel responded in the language it trusted most when danger seemed too serious to wait for. Intelligence, sabotage, assassinations, preemption. The campaign between wars. It tried to interrupt the future before the future arrived. And that is where the tragedy of this story lives. because both sides believed their method was the one preventing catastrophe. Iran believed the shadow war gave it deterrence without requiring suicidal conventional war. Israel believed the shadow war gave it a way to contain threats before they matured into something existential. Each side saw itself as acting defensively inside its own doctrine. Each side believed pressure was necessary because inaction would be punished. Each side thought it was managing escalation. But the structure they built had its own momentum. Every proxy arsenal normalized the next proxy arsenal. Every covert strike normalized the next covert strike. Every humiliation demanded an answer. Every answer taught a lesson. That the enemy only understands force. That ambiguity can be exploited. That retaliation can be calibrated. That pain can be imposed without losing control. Until one day, control itself became the illusion. That is the real payoff of the entire story. The Shadow War was not a lesser form of conflict running parallel to the real one. It was the real one. It was the school in which both sides learned how to think about each other, how to anticipate each other, how to wound each other, and eventually, how to justify crossing lines that once seemed too dangerous to cross. What looked like restraint was often preparation. What looked like containment was often accumulation. What looked like a way to avoid open war was, over time, a way of making open war easier to imagine. That is why this rivalry matters far beyond Iran and Israel themselves. Because it reveals something terrifying about modern conflict. Wars no longer need formal declarations to become permanent. They can be assembled in fragments, in code, in money transfers, in missile components, in airstrikes nobody claims, in armed groups that are local and transnational at the same time, in narratives that turn every concession into weakness and every compromise into betrayal. And once that kind of war matures, peace becomes harder not only because the weapons are ready, but because the story each side tells about the other has hardened too completely. Iran sees Israel not simply as a rival state, but as a foundational enemy in a larger struggle over legitimacy, justice, and regional order. Israel sees Iran not simply as another adversary, but as the architect of a long encirclement project backed by ideology, proxies, missiles, and potentially irreversible strategic ambitions. When two states begin to see each other that way, every crisis arrives already carrying the memory of the last one. That is the aftershock. The missiles and drones were shocking not because they came out of nowhere, but because they revealed how much had already been built underneath them. Decades of doctrine, decades of fear, decades of adaptation, decades of rehearsals conducted in the shadows until the shadows could no longer hold. And that may be the most disturbing truth of all. What began as a relationship hidden in silence became a war hidden in shadows. And by the time the shadows broke, the machinery of conflict was already fully built.